Distinguished guests, excellencies, all protocols observed. I'm Chantal Carrington, CEO at Invest Africa. And on behalf of Invest Africa, I welcome you to the 13th mining series today. Our theme this year is Unlocking Potential, investing in sustainable value chains, growth, and innovation. And this reflects the importance of the broader ecosystem surrounding mineral development. Now, on the topic, and with a focus on renewable energy and critical minerals, I'm pleased to invite to stage Lucas Chamonte, MD and Senior Partner at BCG, to take us through this discussion. Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you all for joining us today for this panel on powering critical minerals in Southern Africa, part of our FCDO Growth Gateway program. Over the past 2 years, we've been supporting the FCDO's Growth Gateway program, which focuses on strengthening two-way investment between the UK and emerging markets to drive inclusive and sustainable growth. The program has delivered over 60 targeted interventions across Africa and Asia. Southern Africa holds close to 30% of the critical minerals reserves in the world. And if strategically mined and processed, this potential can turn into economic value. The unlock to get there is affordable, reliable, and scalable power. And what is important here is that the solutions to this challenge actually exist. In today's session, we will explore practical solutions across project structuring, financing, and the enabling ecosystem. We will try to keep this session focused and interactive. There will be time for questions from the audience, and we will also have the opportunity to continue the discussion over a short networking lunch afterwards. It is now my pleasure to introduce His Excellency Anthony Philipson, British High Commissioner to South Africa, a career diplomat with senior roles across UK foreign and trade policy, including High Commissioner to Singapore. And his presence today reflects the high commitment of the government, the UK government, to drive green growth in the region. Anthony, it's a pleasure to have you, and I invite you now to open the session.
Thank you very much, Lucas. Thank you, everyone, for giving me the chance to be here. Thank you to Chantal and Invest Africa. I remember being in this room a year ago, if you remember, you invited me to chair a panel, and I sat in the most extraordinary chair that had no back, and it sort of had horns reaching up over the top of me. I felt like I'd been elevated. But anyway, wonderful to be with you. And I hope the Invest Africa program is going well. It's always an extraordinary moment when we all come together for Mining Indaba and do so much else besides. Anyway, Minister Macpherson, wonderful to see you. Thank you for joining us for this, and thank you again for your exceptional event last night at your house. And ladies and gentlemen, it's great to see you all. Let me just say a few words about, I think, why this topic is so important to us in the UK government, and why we, I think, are really very focused on working with partners, including many in this room, and especially BCG. Because, a number of the topics over the last couple of days when we've been talking about this have sort of posed a rather obvious question, which is, should we do this together or should we do it alone? Which is, as I say, slightly blindingly obvious, but that doesn't actually mean that we don't have to think about how we do it together. So when we have the chance to bring together groups like this, bringing together key actors from government, the private sector, civil society, academics, to discuss powering critical minerals in South Africa and indeed Southern Africa, it's just vital that we take the opportunity if we are indeed going to make renewable energy bankable for critical minerals projects. Just before I get into some of this, I want to highlight one key moment, which I think reflects some of the progress we're making in the UK, which is that back in 2024, for the first time in our history, renewables produced more than half of the UK's electricity that year. According to the official government statistics, so we can trust those, renewable energy generation reached 50.8%, setting a new national record. And I think what makes this achievement even more impressive for us, at least in the UK, is the role of wind power. The data shows that wind energy alone generated almost 30% of our electricity in 2024, making it the single largest renewable contributor. And that, I think, is a function of stronger wind speeds, increased generation capacity has helped to drive that growth. But wind now stands shoulder to shoulder with gas, almost shoulder to shoulder with gas, as a major part of our national energy mix. And I think this milestone is more than just a statistic. It represents real progress. It represents progress towards cleaner air, lower carbon emissions, greater energy independence and energy security, and a more stable and secure energy future. I think it also demonstrates that the UK is not only committed to leading on renewable energy conversations, but is already taking the action that is necessary. So as we look ahead, I think this achievement gives us some momentum. It gives us a clear signal that investing in clean, homegrown energy is not only good for the planet, but also for the people, economy, and long-term resilience of the United Kingdom. And I think it's that experience that we want to bring into conversations like this on the continent of Africa. So when we talk about renewable energy for critical minerals projects, we're bringing together two essential pillars of the global clean energy future. Critical minerals such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, and rare earth elements are, of course, the building blocks of modern clean technologies. They're essential for solar panels, for wind turbines, electric vehicle batteries, and modern energy storage systems, amongst others. And these minerals are absolutely central to renewable energy deployment worldwide. But there's the challenge for us, because mining and processing these minerals requires a great deal of energy in and of itself. Historically, that energy has come from fossil fuels, and this has created pollution, environmental degradation, and risks to the surrounding communities. The United Nations Environment Programme warns us that mineral production can cause serious greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, and even, of course, social harm if it's not managed responsibly. That's why renewable energy is essential. We can find ways of using solar, wind, hydro, geothermal power to run mines, to run the processing plants and the refining facilities that will allow us to produce these vital minerals without adding to the climate crisis. And it ensures that the technology we rely on are clean not only at the end of the supply chain, but from their very beginning. So this work, I think we all accept and agree, is becoming increasingly urgent because demand for these minerals is rising so rapidly around the world. And today I also want to reflect briefly on the growing role, and I think I hope people feel the high impact role that the United Kingdom is playing in the energy landscape of Southern Africa. This is a region, of course, rich in potential, ambition, and opportunity. But across Africa, hundreds of millions of people still lack reliable access to electricity, despite the fact that the continent holds some of the world's greatest renewable energy resources. And it's against this backdrop that the UK over the last few years has stepped forward as a committed partner for South Africa, others in the region, and others across the continent, supporting a transition that is not only clean, but fair, inclusive, and driven by development and economic growth. One of the clearest examples of this partnership is, of course, here in South Africa. Since 2021, November 21, when we launched it at the COP summit in Glasgow, COP26, the UK has been working with our international partners, France, Germany, the EU, used to be the US, but they dropped out, but the Netherlands and Denmark joined. And we are all working in partnership with South Africa to support South Africa's just energy transition ambitions. Over those last 4.5 years, we have provided financial and technical support to help modernize South Africa's electricity market, from preparing the shift to a wholesale electricity market, to strengthening transmission planning, to advancing reforms that open the door for greater renewable energy investment. These efforts form part of the broader Just Energy Transition Partnership, and as I say, supporting South Africa's own ambitions on the just energy transition to reduce emissions while ensuring energy security and economic growth. Our commitment, though, extends beyond the JTP. Through programs such as UK Pact, we are developing projects that build capacity within South Africa's institutions. These include initiatives to improve municipal energy planning, to support the growth of a green hydrogen economy, and to strengthen alignment with global green finance standards. And in total, the UK has committed many millions of pounds to accelerate a transition that benefits both people, the country, and indeed the planet. At the same time, British-backed companies investing directly in clean energy infrastructure across the region. Globalec, for example, 70% owned by BII, British International Investment, 30% owned by Norfund, continues to expand its footprint in Southern Africa. It is behind South Africa's largest, actually, I think this will be Sub-Saharan Africa's largest battery energy storage project in South Africa, the Red Sands project in the Northern Cape. And it has recently secured financing to deliver Mozambique's first wind power project. Gas to power, battery energy storage, all important steps forward in strengthening the region's renewable energy capacity. And these investments are helping to build energy security, create jobs, support long-term resilience and prosperity. And I think what unites all these efforts, and if I may say, since the Minister is with us, the work we're also doing with his department on the infrastructure side, supporting his ambitions, and I'm rather hoping we're going to hear more about these in a speech tomorrow evening. What unites all of these efforts is a shared vision, a future in which South Africa, Southern Africa can expand electricity access, reduce energy poverty, and grow its economies while embracing clean, affordable, modern energy systems. And the UK sees South Africa very much not as a passive recipient of our support, but as an active partner with enormous potential to lead on its own in renewable energy, green hydrogen, sustainable economic development. And so in closing, I just want to reiterate the United Kingdom's role is clear. We aim to be a partner. We aim to be a partner in investment, a partner in reform, a partner in capacity building, and a partner in helping to build the clean energy systems that will power Southern Africa's future. Together, these efforts are creating an energy transition that is truly just, one that lifts people out of poverty, strengthens economies, leaves no one behind, and moves this incredible region towards a cleaner, more resilient, and more secure tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Big thanks to His Excellency for opening us up this morning, and I'll have to bring this mic slightly down. But morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We're really looking forward to the discussion we're going to have. It's my pleasure actually to introduce our panelists today. I have a few slides, as every good consultant does, to set the scene, but I'll go through that as soon as everybody's up on stage. So maybe first up, I'll call Honourable Dean McPherson, Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure for the Republic of South Africa. Dean McPherson was appointed... Dean McPherson was appointed as Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure on the 3rd of July in 2024. He provides political leadership, sets strategic direction, and oversees delivery across the department's mandate. From 2014 to 2019, he served as the DA Shadow Minister of Trade and Industry and a whip in the National Assembly, and in 2021, he was chairperson of the DA in KwaZulu-Natal. Welcome, Honourable Dean McPherson. Next up, we've got Isabel Fick, who is the Group Head of Trading and Operations from Africa Green Co. Africa Green Co is a renewable energy intermediary that supports the development and financing of clean power markets across sub-Saharan Africa. Isabel is an electrical engineer with over 30 years of experience in the power sector. She's a member of the GO15 governing board, contributing to the global dialogue on the management of large power grids, and formerly served as general manager of the system operator at Eskom, a very tough job, and the National Transmission Company of South Africa, where she led national grid operations, reliability planning, and real-time system balancing during operational constraints. Welcome, Isabel. Next up, we've got Lisa Pinsley, who's the fund head for Africa Transition Acceleration Fund at AIM. AIM is an investment manager group that develops, invests in, and manages infrastructure assets across Africa. Lisa leads early-stage investments supporting Africa's energy transition across clean power, clean fuels, and sustainable transport. Prior to joining AIM, Lisa was a partner and head of Middle East and Africa at Actis, where she led a number of high-impact transactions. Welcome, Lisa. And next, we have Dalo Ajene, who is CEO and Head of Coverage of Africa for Standard Chartered, a seasoned financial services executive with over 2 decades of international banking experience across Africa, the US, Europe, and the Middle East. Dalo has held senior roles at Credit Suisse, BNP Paribas, Bank of America, and Bear Stearns, and was instrumental in the launch of Rand Merchant Bank in Nigeria, where he worked for over 10 years in various local and group functions, ultimately serving as its CEO. Welcome, Dalo. And last but not least, we have Jed Goldstein, who's the infrastructure lead for Zambia at First Quantum Minerals. First Quantum Minerals is currently based in Lusaka, Zambia. Jed's key focus areas include collaborating with Zambia's state power utility ZESCO to ensure sufficient renewable energy power generation for the country's industrial expansion, developing public-private partnerships, and enhancing key transportation corridors, and focusing his efforts to incentivize local content creation across the mineral value chain. Welcome, Jed. And myself, I'm a managing director and partner at BCG. and very happy to be here and moderating the panel today. Thanks. Maybe just to kick things off, we do have a few slides, if I can get that up. Yeah. So when we think about critical minerals, His Excellency mentioned it earlier, right? Critical minerals is massively important for the renewable energy rollout globally. If you look at the forecast of what's needed from a critical minerals perspective, there is supply tightness across all key commodities, copper, nickel, etc., of around 20% for the next 10 years. So finding new reserves and accessing those reserves is going to be critical. And Southern Africa actually has 30% of the world's global reserves. Yeah? And that's very impressive given that if you look even further up in the sort of development life cycle, just to resources and endowment, that number gets even bigger. But just from a reserves point of view alone, we know that it's a significant number and therefore huge potential. In a region that really needs economic growth and needs catalysts for economic growth, this can be a huge opportunity for not just Southern Africa, but Africa as a whole. And you'll see some stats on the right-hand side there. This is about GDP creation, job creation, and I think an important theme that has already been mentioned, which is beneficiation. Last year, we were privileged enough to be the knowledge partner to the B20. And one of the critical elements there was not just about unlocking critical minerals, but ensuring that you can also beneficiate and have the value chains locally so that we can actually valorize those minerals and ensure that there is a just transition at the end of the day. And so in the context of that opportunity, what we wanted to discuss today, even though this is the mining indaba, is the critical role that renewables plays in enabling these critical minerals opportunities, right? We know that renewable energy, wind, solar, battery storage is lower cost. And it's important that we think about that lower cost in the context of a system. We're not saying that everything can run over solar and wind and battery, but as a mix, for many studies that we've done and many other companies have done, it is by far the least cost path for many countries. It ensures power for remote operations, and I think it's a massive opportunity if we think about the energy access issue that His Excellency mentioned earlier. I mean, 600 million people in Africa don't have access to electricity today. That number has stayed almost constant for the last 10 years. And if you look at the rest of the world, they're all sitting at around 80% of energy access at least. So a sticky problem for Africa, and there are no income-rich, energy-poor countries in the world. So energy access is going to be very critical. And then lastly, lower carbon production. Lower carbon production, I think in the context that we see ourselves today globally, many companies have actually asked, is this still going to go ahead? We see CBAM coming in. What's really the kind of catalyst there? Is it going to happen? And actually, low carbon production has become not just a sustainability agenda. It's actually an economic competitiveness agenda now. And actually a trade agenda. When you think about protecting manufacturing value chains, et cetera, this is here to stay. So we think that this is clearly a massive opportunity and a big enabler for critical minerals. But of course, given the context, it's not going to be easy, as it is for unlocking the critical minerals opportunity. Market design and regulation is going to be key. A lot of the minerals and where the actual energy sits to power these mines are not necessarily always in the same country. So cross-border regulation, collaboration is very important. Infrastructure, which is enabled through that regulation, is also just as important. I mean, we've heard a lot around the interconnectors in the Southern Africa space, the massive enabling factor that plays towards increasing liquidity in the Southern African power pool. Bankability and capital mobilization. I mean, it's great to see the financiers in the room today, and I think we'll have a good discussion around that pillar. And then lastly, technical and commercial alignment. Of course, this is about renewable energy, and managing renewable energy in a grid when it is intermittent is also not a trivial point, but something we've proven we can do. So bringing all of this together is a little bit what we're trying to use the session to unlock, right? So we're saying, if those are the kind of key themes of blockers that we see across the renewable energy projects in Southern Africa, what are some of the kind of real roadblocks underneath those different themes? And really, can we get to some innovative solutions and ways of enabling those innovative solutions? I think sometimes on panels, we generally have good ideas. I think in this panel, we've got the right mix of people on stage to talk about how do you drive from ideas to implementation. And I would hope that we cover that in our discussion today. So without further ado, I will shift to the first set of questions on this panel. And by the way, to those in the room, if you do want to ask questions along the way, you can scan that QR code. I will get it, and I'll try to blend them into the discussion as well. But maybe first to Minister McPherson, based on your experience in government, I think one of the key things to get right in unlocking all of this complexity is going to be the system rules of making this work, right? So how do you get this collaboration? How do you get regulation to tie up with infrastructure, to tie up with projects, project development? In your view, where do you see some of the key challenges? And we'll get to solutions just now. So maybe we can start with the key challenges.
Thank you very much, and great to be here with you. I'm sorry that Anthony let slip that I had a party at my house last night, because everyone wants to know why they weren't invited. But it was really good if you weren't there. And I apologize for the way that I'm dressed, but I had a thought coming in here that, people often say you shouldn't trust a skinny chef, and you may want to apply that to an infrastructure minister who arrives in a suit and tie. And I often say to the president that I dress like this because I'm actually on site getting things done. And, we have the State of the Nation address, and we were just there before getting things ready. So, I think that the question that you ask is important, and I would answer it this way, that when a new power project gets going in South Africa, they can require almost up to or beyond 60 different types of permits or licenses just before they do anything. And while that sort of regulation and licensing is important, it can become quite difficult for those project sponsors to learn how to navigate that environment and that field. And so what we've done through Infrastructure South Africa, which is an entity that sits within our department, is to work with project sponsors and private sector companies to navigate that field and to actually do a lot of the legwork for them. And we've seen dramatic reductions in some of those licensing timelines, in some instances cutting them in half. And that's good. I mean, that's important, and government must play that role. But I think that often what government can tend to do is, they will come up with an important infrastructure idea or plan, and then seek to institute those regulations and rules afterwards. I think that we need to change that approach to say, let's develop those rules and regulations before we actually embark on that infrastructure journey. So, particularly, I think as we move into the discussion around critical minerals, how are we going to power that extraction, particularly in remote places? We can't develop a critical minerals agenda without actually developing an agenda of how we're going to extract them. And I'm not sure that those discussions are taking place as they. And I think clearly this week, one of the big things that jumped out at me this week is that there's clearly a big focus on Southern Africa, and particularly South Africa now. And that was highlighted actually in the US now sending its largest delegation ever to mining Indaba. And, it's not a secret that there's, been ongoing issues between the two countries. But even beyond the political rhetoric and even beyond the policy disagreements, we can see that South Africa is now headed to be one of the forefront players in that space. So certainly through ESA, we are working really hard to reframe the agenda of ensuring that policy regulation is clear up front before we embark on those journeys, and where we need to step in and where we need to assist in regulatory approval and permitting. We have a pretty good track record of actually getting that job done in record time.
Thanks for sharing those thoughts, Minister. I think this issue of permits and licensing always comes up, and I think the work that you've done is really commendable to reduce the timelines. And I think from what I've seen, there are sort of two lenses there, right? One is around designing that policy and permitting process in a way that makes it efficient, so you can do bundled applications, for example, and then the capacity to streamline the application itself. And I think it's great to see the work that's already been going on in your department on that. Maybe I'll hand over to you, Isabel. I mean, we talked, I mentioned in the upfront pages a little bit the complexity when it comes to infrastructure management, system management. And I know you're wearing a different hat now at Africa Green Co, but I would love if you could touch on both elements of sort of from a system management technical point of view, where do you see some of the challenges? And also from a market perspective, from a trading market liquidity perspective, where are some of the challenges as well?
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Minister. That's some nice technical help I'm getting from the side here. Yes, I think there's quite a few challenges on either side of the equation. So if I can start on the market side, of course, being an electricity trader, one of the most important things to make these projects bankable is that we need a set of clear rules. And then you need to be able to actually have price certainty. All of these things then translates into bankability and then, of course, scaling. So if we have proof of concept and we then can move through all of the regulations and rules, that should go a long way. Of course, we need backing by proper funding. And of course, we are talking investment grade funding, because that is going to give us the bankability without having to need all of the sovereign guarantees, which we know is a major challenge and obstacle. When it comes to the system itself, technically, there's a number of challenges. In terms of the projects, one of the key things that we did see is the lack of cooperation. Basically a silo approach in planning. So you have the project and whoever's constructing the project is doing what they need to do. But the collaboration between them and the utility, as an example, needs a lot of improvement. When you do planning, you need to start doing your planning jointly. And the reason I'm saying that is because often what we have found in practice is that once we get to the point of commissioning, we often find that very significant aspects that may not seem that significant from a construction perspective, but very much so from a system perspective, have been left behind and is kind of brought in later in the design. And as a practical example, the necessary telecommunication linkages. Now, obviously, for any project, this is absolutely key to be able to do the metering, the monitoring, and all of the rest. But it takes months of design to get there. So when you actually come at the end of the construction period and now you have to rush things, you end up with a lot of problems in practice. So that's just one example. For me, the key would be to do the planning upfront jointly and form a collaboration. In terms of Greenco, we specialize specifically in doing so and bringing the not only the IPP and the off-taker together, but also bringing the utility into the room so that we have a cohesive environment where everybody plans together, everybody knows that we have bankability of a project and where we're going forward with it. Yeah, I think from a practical perspective, those are the biggest issues that we've seen in terms of not collaborating properly.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I think the example you gave on sort of the systems around monitoring the plant, data, smart metering, etc., is becoming even more important as you're getting to higher levels of penetration on the grid. So that's going to be, it was an issue in the past, it's probably going to be even more important going forward. Yeah.
And maybe just to add to that point, thanks for the reminder. Yes, the more penetration on renewables we are seeing on the network, the more volatility and instability you can expect. And there's let me not get into the most technical detail as to why that is the case. So it's also very important to pay attention to the type of technology. the recommendation here is not to go for a singular technology, but rather moving towards hybrid plants. And what I mean with hybrid plants is combining your key technology with storage. This is not only important for having a longer supply of the power, because batteries, for instance, will give an extra 4 hours a day. So that will extend your daytime hours for, in the case of PV, for instance. But then combining that with grid forming batteries, which then will add an element of stability to the network itself. So if we work together, we can all come up with the right technologies to actually support the whole system. An added advantage to that is that these type of technologies also offer ancillary services support, which then can, in the long run, be an offset in terms of cost, because these are things that we expect in South Africa will form a secondary market. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great point, Isabel. And I think, you know, there's always this interplay, and it goes back to having the right planning in mind, right? Where if you think about what's technically needed to get to the least cost system, it's one sort of view of the world that you get. But then you have to have the price signals and the market making mechanisms. You talk about ancillary services, et cetera, and how do you actually compensate for that? So, you know, with that in mind, that adds another level of complexity to the discussion. And I would actually go to you, Lisa, and say, from a financier's perspective, there's, of course, the short-run considerations when it comes to bankability, et cetera. But some of the things that Isabel is talking about here are things that are, you know, unknown unknowns a little bit, right? Where the system is changing, the policy landscape is changing, the infrastructure around you is changing. How are you dealing with that from a financing point of view?
Yeah, thank you, Kesh. Maybe just to back up 1 second, I'm the equity on the panel, I guess. You're the debt on the equity, so I'm speaking from that perspective. And, you know, both my organization, AIM, and I have been around the market for a few decades now. And AIM, as the largest infrastructure GP on the continent, has been investing for a long time in the power sector. So first, you know, throughout the IPPs on the continent, and then, of course, throughout the REAP programs here in South Africa. And through our funds, we've backed IPPs like Anthem and NOAA, who have together about 3 gigawatts of generation. So all to say is that's my braggawatts. We have a lot of gigawatts and a lot of history there. What my new fund at AIM does actually is back the earlier stage developers in the more exciting, the more frontier markets, let's say. So this African Transition Acceleration Fund, we are very actively looking at backing young developers in the Southern Africa Power Pool with those dynamics of the huge supply and demand gap, and then the huge mining demand driving that acceleration, plus the market liberalizations. So that's kind of who we are and where I'm coming from. When I thought about your question, Kesh, about what's kind of holding back more renewables for mining projects, the scale and across the markets, I took a step back because over the past 15 years, there are now 2 options, right? Embedded generation within the mine site and wheeled power. And pretty much all I want to talk about now is the wheeled power. And I'm in that camp, but for a long time, there were embedded generation projects. You know, you couldn't wheel power. There wasn't the market liberalization. And so you see a lot of developers coming up with 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt, 200 megawatt projects in countries that, you know, generally investors don't go to very often in the power sector. And there are a lot of pros, you know, it's embedded, so you don't have to deal with the utility, you don't have to deal with transmission risk. It's on its own site. You generally have quite a bankable off-taker if it's one of the larger mines. It's quick. But I think one of the key problems with the embedded model, and it's still happening, but I think the excitement and the growth is really in this wheeled model, because I see it as very difficult to scale. So as an investor, I don't want to just put in $10 million. I want to put in $200 million and do it again and again and again and grow to scale. And I think in the embedded space, that's quite difficult. And so that pushes us into the wheeled space. But that's a very new, a few years really only that it's been available. So there's a ton of excitement around that now and almost a gold rush of project development in the SAP region. And I'm not really talking about South Africa because that rush has already been going for a few years, which is fantastic. But the key challenges then I see on the wheeled power to mines and the bankability, and very curious to see, I wish Jed had gone first because you're on the opposite side of this. And Isabel, you're in the middle. The key challenges we've talked about, the transmission bottlenecks and constraints. So it isn't one big open market and you can build anywhere and sell anywhere. First, there isn't the capacity to move the electrons, and then you might have 3, even 4 utilities to deal with and negotiate with on the way. So all of that is quite complex. The regulatory regimes that you've mentioned, Isabel, it's again, in each country that you are either building in or going through or selling to has its own wheeling regulation, its own wheeling charges, export charges, loss charges. Can you wheel? In Namibia, you can only sell 30% of an off-taker's demand. Everybody is different, and harmonizing that is going on, which I think is a positive, but there's a far way to go. So each project that reaches close is very bespoke, which is fascinating from an intellectual perspective and good for the lawyers, but it takes time. I like lawyers. I mean, good lawyers are worth, it's not a thing, not a dig at lawyers, but.
Depends on which side of the argument you're on.
And then finally, the government support. I actually was reminiscing with Anna, one of the co-founders of Greenco. I mean, she's been singing from every panel for 12 or 15 years about this requirement for government support really holding back the scaling of the power sector. And we all agreed with her, but didn't know what the solution was. And now we're seeing that solution, but it's not perfect yet, because still you do an IPP in Zambia and you wheel that power, you still need an implementation agreement with the government on, you know, what if there's a big grid outage or other types of things. So those are the types of things we still have to work through. And as the market matures, that will be less required, but it's just, there's a lot of hair. It's exciting, but it's not 5 gigawatts tomorrow.
Indeed, and I think you raise a good point, right? When you think about the coordination that's needed on these policy regulatory decisions, it's not just within country, it's inter-country as well in the region. And maybe that's one for you, Minister. I'll go to the other panelists first, but I'm going to come back to you with that question around what is that sort of cross-regional unlock from a collaboration point of view that we could think through. But we heard sort of the equity view from you, Lisa. Dada, I'm going to hand over to you from a debt perspective. How do you reconcile all of this complexity in the space with the lens that you have? I mean, particularly given that you've got this relationship with the more debt that you can secure against a project, of course, the better the tariff's going to be, the more bankable it's going to be, et cetera. But of course, then the less risk you can take on. And how do you think about getting the right mix of your debt into these projects? And where do you see some of the big challenges?
No, thanks. So I think, look, a lot has been said in terms of, call it, you know, the structural considerations in terms of bringing financing to match some of these opportunities. I think it's also important to also give some credibility and credit to, you know, Minister McPherson and your department in terms of what has happened in South Africa in terms of the REAP program. And the REAP program was the beginning of, call it, truly testing, you know, the capacity for some of these private sponsors to play a much more involved role in a deregulated power sector under a framework that people can actually look at, allocate risk, and get, you know, some sort of national treasury cover to de-risk some of the exposures that were required on massive set of investments. You're talking about, you know, at some point over $17 billion invested in the sector, over 79 projects, you know, 5,300 megawatts, significant. And I think that set the stage for a lot of the conversations we're having around whether wheeled power, embedded IPP projects, et cetera. From a bankability standpoint, one of the first things we look at is the sponsor, right? So do we have a strong sponsor that has the capabilities to be able to deploy the project in an appropriately de-risked way, whether it's operational risk, et cetera. And then you look at the policy environment, how that policy environment is actually set. And again, like I said, a lot of that has been, call it the foundational elements has been set in stone. And through those foundational elements, now you're testing, areas of complexity, particularly around the power purchase agreement, which is at the core of what we're really, banking. So from a bank standpoint, we're really thinking about, the various risk elements of a project to be able to guarantee, call it the technical capabilities of that project to deliver power, but also the ability of the off-taker to be able to pay under a consistent framework that stands the test of time. And that's where one of our biggest challenges and times that we spend in terms of the PPA becomes quite complicated in being able to get a lot more projects off the ground, because each PPA would literally take, 12 to 24 months of negotiations with significant amount of risk, call it calibration and boxing to figure out who takes on, different elements of crystallization of defaults, et cetera. And how do you share the risk between the various stakeholders, which is a very complex process of negotiations. And that's why I actually wanted to give South Africa a lot of credit, because if you think about a lot of the countries that we cut across as Standard Chartered in Africa, you realize that the policy framework isn't robust enough for us to deploy capital at scale to be able to solve some of these, power challenges to really, benefit a lot of the mining capabilities that we have in multiple countries around Africa. So again, South Africa being a very important player there. I think clearly, we talked about what they call it, Salisa talked about some of this transmission considerations. And I think that's very important because, given the amount of, call it, whether solar or wind resources in South Africa and being able to wheel it across into neighboring countries becomes a very important evolution forward of where we're going within the power, call it, generating space. And that ability to have, policy consistency, interconnect rules, pricing mechanisms, loss ratios, when it goes into ESCOM versus not ESCOM, et cetera. All of that brings, again, another level of complexity, because there, as a banker, we're not just saying, look, you can actually do a wind power plant and send it to First Quantum, but it's not just the First Quantum risk. If the grid goes down, who do you actually hold accountable? Do you hold First Quantum? Do you hold ESCOM? Who pays for that risk, et cetera? So I think there's a lot of complexity in terms of what is needed to allow the full fit loop to work so that we can actually operate at scale, because there are massive, call it, sources of power. There are evolving sponsors that are credible. There are frameworks that allow all of this to work in terms of the policy. But then, this transmission element, I think, is going to be the next thing to really solve. In addition to that, like I mentioned, some of the complexities around negotiating the PPA, there's also a new school of thought in terms of how aggregators play a role of buying power and then disaggregating the tenor risk in a PPA and being able to sell that in a credible way to off-takers like First Quantum in a, call it, 2, 5, 7, 10-year bites that allows all the various, call it, role players an ability to allocate risk in a way that allows the system to work. So I think the evolution of aggregators and how they actually help solve some of this transmission risk issues is going to be a very important, should I say, next step in terms of being able to scale, large scale, call it, wheel power capacity across multiple different parts, geographical locations, and channel it into, the off-takers that actually are credible and need it in a bite size that actually works for them, as opposed to just being committed on 20-year PPA on the balance sheet of First Quantum or others. That can be very tasking on those balance sheets. So I think those are some of the elements. And then finally, I think from aggregators goes to the trading, of power. So I think there's just so much evolution that makes the power industry very exciting. I think from a bank like ourselves, we play multiple roles from a Standard Chartered standpoint. First, we obviously leverage our balance sheet for projects that work based on all these risk types. But beyond leveraging our balance sheet, we play a very important intermediation role in terms of bringing in other role players, from DFIs to multilaterals to agencies to insurance, to be able to de-risk projects in a blended way that allows the cost of funding to actually work for the project. So that's a very important role that we play. And then recently, over the last, I'll say 12 to 14 months, we've also seen the maturity of a lot of these power projects get to the point where you're actually having, call it strategic M&A type discussions. And that's exciting, because at least you're seeing sponsors that invested in projects, call it 7 to 10 years ago, who are now thinking about, what next? Do they continue to aggregate on a portfolio basis? Do they monetize some of that early stage risk that they've taken? And are there other partners that can actually, buy into assets from a portfolio standpoint and take it to the next level? Because like we know, power assets are infrastructure assets, and they meet the requirements of certain types of investors, particularly annuity investors. So we see a very exciting process to actually think about investors that can actually take this industry to the next level and bring a lot more stability in terms of capital sources. 2 transactions that we worked on over the last 12 to 14 months is helping Northfund invest in one of your assets, actually. That's the Anthem Fund and Molito Fund. I'm sorry, Molito assets and the Anthem assets. And we're also, involved in Uganda and selling, power assets, et cetera. So I think it's literally a very exciting time for a bank like Standard Chartered to be involved in 1, funding, 2, intermediating capital flows in a blended way, and 3, thinking about strategic conversations around a lot of these power assets.
Indeed, and thanks for that, Dalu. I think particularly like the point you made around like what is the right mechanism to figure out how to share that risk most appropriately across the value chain and across the project. And I think that's maybe something we can come back to in the solutioning, is like, what is the right platform and mechanism to do that? Is it efficient today? Can it be improved? But maybe to you, Jet, I mean, you are looking at it from the perspective of a credible buyer that, Dalu mentioned that, most banks are looking for credible off-takers in this region. Where do you see the complexities from the other side of the equation?
Sure. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I just would like to zoom out a bit. So First Quantum, we operate 3 mines in Zambia, 2 copper mines, 1 nickel mine. We produce out of Zambia around 450,000 tons of copper per year. Zambia's total production is around 800,000 tons a year, so we represent about half of Zambia's total production. We have a long history in Zambia. We've been there 20 plus years. We're very comfortable with the jurisdiction, and we believe in the country's future. So to also, again, to zoom out, the president was here at Indaba, President Hichilema, and he has, since the day of his inauguration, he's called for Zambia to effectively triple copper production over the course of the next 10 years. So to move from 800,000 tons right now to 3 million tons. That is an ambitious goal, but it's not impossible. To put that in perspective, the DRC about 10, 15 years ago was producing 1 million tons of copper, and today they're producing 3 million. So it's possible, and especially with elevated prices where they are right now because of demand for global electrification, it is within the realm of something that we can see. Copper mining is a power intensive process. So First Quantum's mines, we're mining copper that has a grade of around 0.4%. And so that 0.4% rock essentially needs to be upgraded to 99%. You could imagine how much movement, how much crushing is required in order to do that. It's millions and millions of tons of earth movement. First Quantum's total power demand in Zambia is around 360 megawatts across our operations. And that represents about 10% of total grid demand. So you have installed capacity in Zambia of around 3,000 megawatts. So First Quantum, one consumer of power represents 10% of demand. Just imagine what happens when Zambia has 3 million tons of copper production. There needs to be a lot more power online. How do you do that? How do you accomplish that? Well, companies need to take charge of their energy futures, and they need to do so in a responsible way. Something else that you need to think about when you're zooming out is that Zambia currently only has 50% of the population connected to the grid. 50% of the population connected to the grid in a country that is effectively electrifying the world. Zambia has been a copper producer for a long time. Before I was born, 1950s, 1960s, maybe even before that. And it would be an absolute tragedy if by the end of Zambia's copper extraction journey, if only 50% of the country was connected to the electricity grid. That would be a tragedy. So companies need to take charge, they need to participate, and need to support the state power utility, the government of Zambia, to electrify the grid and to bring more generation online. So that's critical, and it needs to be done together, because you won't achieve development behind the meter. You won't achieve development by creating an island of prosperity within a much larger ecosystem. And so that's why we're very keen to be working, as Isabel and Lisa were talking about, with the utility, with IPPs, to try to work out appropriate risk matrices to encourage more generation and to make sure that all of the contingent liabilities are appropriately distributed across the different parties. Yeah, we're very excited. There's a lot of potential. Zambia, being a land-linked country, has 8 borders. It has a stable jurisdiction. So we believe that it could become an energy powerhouse, and not only have kind of an extractive copper model, but actually be electrifying the region with some really nice renewable energy. Zambia has plentiful hydro resources. Looking at wind projects, we're looking at, of course, solar projects. So tons and tons of potential that we're very excited as a large energy user to be participating in, and seeing ways that we can benefit not only our operations, but also that corresponds to Zambia's development agenda. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chad. And I think a very powerful reflection around 50%, electrification gap in a country that's electrifying the world. I think that's very profound. And as you say, a tragedy if we can't fix that. But I think it comes back to sort of these coordination gaps that exist, across regulation, infrastructure, et cetera. In fact, we've got a few questions that have come through in the Q&A. Thanks for sending that through. And they speak to the same thing around where we've seen examples of, coordination being unlocked and therefore leading towards projects that are more bankable. But also, where could governments bridge that gap? What are some of the kind of solutions to that? And maybe I'm going to start with you, Minister. What are some thoughts on how to get this coordination gap plugged?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that Treasury has done really well over the last while is to say, we understand that there is a risk in each project, and that government has to allocate something towards that risk. And so up until last year, the budget for infrastructure was only meeting once a year. And we had approached the Treasury and we had said, look, if you're going to want to speed up these projects, you've got to start putting more allocation towards de-risking these projects, particularly in places like power and water. And so the Treasury then announced last year that they would then scale up those bid windows to 4 per year. And I have a suspicion that an additional one is going to come this year as well. Because we understand as a government that, we have to put something on the table. We have to de-risk those projects to the extent that we can, particularly some of those, margins that include indigent contributions, particularly in electricity and water. So how do we quantify that? How do we put that into the deal, de-risk it, and then attract investment quicker, and then to move it going forward? And so I think that that is going to be a profound change in the direction of projects going forward. But I think that also one must look and use REAP as a good example. 10 years ago or so, it was a very different story than it is today. There was a lot of suspicion about the program. There was a lot of ambiguity about the program and opaqueness to it. And as those, rules were defined, and as, government started moving forward with that, that program is very, very different today. And, independent power is critical to South Africa's future. 10 years ago, there was no thought or view on actually having independent power play the role that it does today. So, sometimes governments also move in a direction that they don't necessarily want to, but over time, you can see that progress that takes place. And that really comes actually from one place and one place only, from the private sector saying to government, this is where the market is heading. This is what has to take place for us to be able to participate. You need to actually get that moving. And I think that government is far more responsive today to the private sector, at least in electricity, than it was a decade ago. So, I don't know that there's one particular, metric that moves us in a direction, but I think, cumulative discussions, cumulative viewpoints on what we need to do, to get more players into the sector particularly help. And, I think what we've learned from REAP, we're actually now transmitting that into water. And my hope really, and the work that we are doing, certainly through Infrastructure SA, is to try and now speed up that particular sector of infrastructure as we see, problems developing in provinces like Gauteng and so on. I think that water now is our new problem that we have to deal with than we did a decade ago. So, my view and my point that I keep making to, audiences like this is that you've got to remain engaged. You've got to keep giving feedback to government, because at the time, maybe it doesn't feel like that we're listening, but actually, if you go back a decade ago, you can see how all of those discussions actually paid off.
Hello. Yeah. I think this concept of collaboration between private sector and public sector, I mean, there's been many examples, I think, in South Africa. You mentioned REAP. I think even if we think about the load shedding crisis and the way that government and private sector came together to try and fix that and get us out of that situation was very, very inspiring, actually. And maybe a follow-up question is, what are some of the ingredients of success to make that level of coordination, even though it may not be perfect? How do we start getting that to a more regional level?
It's a good question. And actually, at our Sustainable Infrastructure Symposium that we hold every year, which is our premier infrastructure sort of focus, we actually contemplated this with 14 other ministers from Africa in the region and the rest of the continent. And we said, what is it going to take to be able to, have more regional integration in infrastructure projects? And there were a couple of things that came to mind. One, there isn't a common language that we use in how we actually define infrastructure projects and programs, particularly within Southern Africa. The second problem is that, while South Africa may be funding risk in particular projects, that may not necessarily be so in other countries. And so there's got to be, I think, regional agreement on how those funding mechanisms meet, equally. How we use DFIs and other countries use DFIs are two different models. Of course, we have a number of MDBs that exist, but I think that there's a lot of work to be able to de-risk projects from both sides. Because if only one country is de-risking projects and another one is not, you know, and there is a regional pipeline in that project, it's bound not to work. And I think that that is something that we've got to urgently take forward this year, particularly in transmission, particularly in generation, particularly in freight and logistics as well. So I think that that is still a big impediment as to, you know, how do we share that risk between countries on multi-country infrastructure projects.
No, excellent, Minister. Thanks for sharing that. I think some great reflections. Just a time check, so we've got 10 more minutes for the panel. I want to just do a check in the room. We have had a few questions come through on the chat, but anybody want to ask a question live? Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Mark Taylor. I'm part of Capital. I'd like to just start with the question that Isabel probably did. I think about, there's been some conversation among panelists about trading energy. And I'm interested just to know the South African wholesale electricity trading platform that's being developed. How much of an impact, how important? Thank you. How important is the launch of that in April, and how much of a difference do you think it'll make to price discovery and to enabling the financeability, to pick up what Dalu said, of projects?
The short answer is it's critically important. It's the only way that we can liberate the market in South Africa, and yes, towards a price stability and more bankability situation. However, April is not a magic date. And I think that is something that we all need to be very clear on. The planning of SARIM starting in April will be a soft launch initially, whereby the market will start operating, but mostly within an internal Eskom environment. Only later on opening up to the private market, which should be much later in the year, but still within this actual calendar year. So that's the expectation, but of course there are precursors that need to be in place, such as the market rules, the market code, the tariff structure. All of these are still outstanding regulatory requirements for the market to function. Not all of them will be a hard stop for the date of April, but we may see some delay depending on how long it will take for all of these different aspects to come together. But getting back to the question, absolutely critical. It's the only way that we can unbundle the electricity. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an excellent point. And look, when you look at markets across the globe, I think within SAP itself, correct me if I'm wrong there, yeah, Isabel, but I think South Africa makes up around 90% of all sort of trading volumes in SAP at the moment. Yeah? And go ahead.
Yes, that's correct. But we also must say that the SAP market has been operating for much longer, around 5 years now. So that's also where we as Greenco have established ourselves currently in 4 countries, and then of course moving into the new market space in South Africa. But in terms of network size, definitely the anchor, the South African grid is around 48,000 megawatt. In size, peak power that we've seen in South Africa around 35,000 megawatts, although that has significantly reduced over the last couple of years as a result of the influx of renewables, and then that comes with a number of balancing problems. So yes, definitely, if you compare that, for instance, with a country like Lesotho, Lesotho's peak demand is around 150 megawatts. So you compare that to 35,000, and you can see the significant difference in scale. So South Africa is and will be for a very long time the anchor of the Southern African power pool in terms of scalability and to wheel power. Once we see a major infrastructure development, as we know, there's a number of large projects around the Mozambique and Congo areas. When that happens, that will bring significant change in the trading patterns, but those are quite a few years off.
Please, go ahead, Alan.
No, I was going to add just that point because I think this concept of investment in the grid becomes a very important enabler to allow, call it to optimize the trading potential, right? Because, it all comes down to how do you increase the number and users, the number of users of, call it power, right? And if you have, investment in grid, smart grid systems and ability to be able to get power to the source of the user in mass, then I think you become a much more efficient trading opportunity where, buyers of power across a large, call it geographical footprint, whether in the SADC region or not, can actually connect into sellers of power in a smart way. So I think the whole ecosystem requires a fair amount of still a lot of investment because yes, you can have trading, and if trading is done within the context of a small geographical footprint, you're not maximizing, call it the inefficiencies that actually exist, and for traders to really put in a lot of capital because it also goes into different layers because traders can also invest in storage systems and can store power and get it into source of the right buyer. But again, there's a lot of technology, a lot of, call it smart systems that are required in all of that to work for you to really get the true benefit of, call it, trading power.
I have to jump in, yeah. I absolutely agree with what you're saying. And I think the point that has to be made is we talk a lot about the interconnectors between the countries because that's the one enabling force for winning, right? But we should not be short-sighted and only limit our thinking to the interconnector. You have a whole heap of infrastructure strengthening that has to take place between the different interconnectors to actually have bulk power flow across these networks. Networks that were not designed for very high voltage. And let me qualify, there's a difference between 132 kV, a 400 kV, and a 765 kV. So for larger distances, which is what we're talking about, if you want to wheel across the different countries, you are going to need significant infrastructure investment. Not only for the interconnectors itself, but for the rest of the networks. And that is where I think that private partnership is going to become extremely important. Yes, we do rely on the state to provide the infrastructure to a certain extent, but I think across the world, you'll see all the models where we have moved beyond that. India, for instance, China are prime examples of private investment in transmission infrastructure. South Africa is now starting off with the ITP program, where we will also do the pilot and see how that can be refined for our country. But it is something that is not limited to pockets. It is something that we need to develop across the region for the greater good of all of our economies.
Indeed, indeed. And I'm just going to ask my panelists if you could just prepare 1 minute closing sort of summary of your thoughts. But in the interim, whilst you think, I'm going to just share a few more questions that I've seen come through the Q&A. I think one of them has been around, particularly to you, Dalu, around the opportunities you see in the SAP market and how do you see bankability of projects that are willing to play in that SAP pool? And is Standard Chartered, what is Standard Chartered bringing to the market to unlock those opportunities, which I think you addressed. And I think I'm going to bolt onto that the question to you, Lisa, which is, you mentioned backing early stage players in this space, be that in the trading space or in the sort of development space as well. Can you qualify a little bit what you mean by early stage and the types of support that you provide? Maybe first you, Dalu.
Yeah, no, I think I'll just be very quick. I think we covered a lot of this. At the end of the day, Standard Chartered doesn't just look at itself as a bank that leverages its own resources. If not, that would be very limited. We spend a lot of time understanding, different participants in the power space in this region, and we're able to facilitate finding bankable projects, structuring those bankable projects, but not being limited to structuring the bankable projects for our balance sheet, but thinking very critically around, the various financing sources and being able to partner with those financing sources to be able to aggregate a lot more firepower to be able to support a project at scale. And like I mentioned, those partners are everywhere from, DFIs to ECA development agencies to, credit agencies to insurance, and also syndicating partner banks into transactions. And then obviously also working with equity providers to be able to provide that, call it early stage, risk capital that's required to get the sponsor off the ground before you get to a bankability stage. So so I think, we're very active in the market, both for ourselves, that's i.e. our balance sheet, but more importantly, we're even more active in terms of really working with, intermediated capital to be able to channel that capital to the appropriate projects depending on the risk type.
Thanks, Tyler. Over to you, Lisa.
So, okay, my 1 minute closing and answer to that question, all in one.
You can have two for each.
I can have two?
Oh, well, one in total for each.
Well, you're not going to interrupt me anyway until I get to 5. We started with the challenges earlier today, but I did want to leave on a note of optimism. I think it's a super exciting space right now. I first came to South Africa in 2011. Thank you to REAP. I thought I would come for a year or two and then move on. And then I kept on staying for the next round and the next round. And it got a little boring after a while because it was pretty smooth going. And then the market liberalization happened. In fact, I remember 15 years ago, a friendly South African colleague took me to a parliamentary subcommittee that was talking for 2 years about how to procure a consultant to look at the unbundling of Eskom. And I thought this is never going to happen in my lifetime. But here we are, and wheeled power is booming and SAWIM is coming, and actually felt like a long time, but it hasn't been a long time. It's also really exciting to me that 10 years ago, I never would have come to mining in Indaba. I mean, that was a whole different world. And now look at all of us power people here, kind of at the same parties, and maybe not the same parties, but similar parties.
Get invited next year.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. So and to me, sort of, it's exciting intellectually because there are all these challenges to solve together, and we have to do it, kind of all of us here on the stage together, and that's live again. Very specifically, what we will do, when I say we'll back early stage players in this sector, especially in the SAP region, because in South Africa, we're quite busy already with NOAA and Anthem, which are similar to the Global X. Whether you're a power developer who, it's not just a piece of paper and a dream, but has put some work into developing a project and has gotten it to a certain stage, but needs more funding, both overheads, development costs, flexible funding, as well as construction equity. We'll come in and work with you on that, not to buy your project and then put it into a big platform and say goodbye and see you in 10 years, but to back these local and regional developers to grow themselves into the next Global Like Anthem, NOAA, because there is so much opportunity. We would also look at different opportunities within the whole sector, transmission, as we talked about, all the private sector investment in transmission now is super exciting and new. Aggregators, traders. So we have this flexible funding, commercial, I would say, it's not, impact funding, it's commercial funding. And we're here to accelerate the sector in that way.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm gonna then let Jed, Tolu, and Isabel conclude with 1 minute summaries, and then hand over to Minister for closing remarks on stage. So maybe first to you, Jed.
Sure, thanks. So I guess my closing thoughts would be that in this room alone, I see a bunch of developers that First Quantum is working with. We have Chariot, we have Wafubu, we have Globalec. We've spoken to a lot of you developing amazing projects in Zambia, projects that we hope actually get onto the grid. And we see banks here as well, I don't know, and government delegations. So what I would just ask and plead for not only Zambia's mining community, but for the larger community of Zambia at large, is that we have singular messaging related, that we all want the same thing. Behind the scenes, we're all probably angry at each other, the tariff's not high enough, or we're not providing enough support or whatever it might be, but we need to actually be very kind of unified in terms of delivering messages to DFIs, to government authorities related to what type of support is needed to bring more power onto the grid, because power is the puzzle piece that unlocks everything else. Without power, you cannot have development, you cannot have economic growth, you cannot bring people out of poverty. So it is so important. Yeah, so just a unified message and all playing on the same team as we try to bring these projects to life and pursue new paradigms of operation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jed. And hand over to David.
Me?
Yeah. Oh.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, look, I think Jed kind of took a lot of what I would say around collaboration, but I'll take it one step further. That collaboration okay, actually, let me take one step back. I think it's around commitment. So this concept of having governments that are committed to engaging with the private sector to solve real problems is at the heart of the success of any, call it, public infrastructure, right? Because if you don't have the policymakers that are equally committed to solving the issues with the private sector, there wouldn't be enough investments to be able to get out of the gates in terms of solving the gaps. So again, I'll just continue to encourage the government in terms of those deep engagements that are underpinned by a true commitment to resolving, infrastructural gaps, in this case, power. So that's one. And I think once you have that resolved, then it's around getting all the role players around the table, as Jed had said, to be able to solve, place the issues on the table, collaborate, and resolve and move forward. And I think with that, then you're able to attract large sources of capital. So I think, capital looks for a home where, there's consistent policy and a return framework where they can actually generate, sufficient returns for their capital. And I think if you can solve that equation, then I think South Africa, Africa will be able to attract the large sources of capital that are required over multiple years to be able to resolve the power gap that exists, not only in mining, but across our various nations, to be able to resolve some of these, multi-generational community issues that need to be resolved.
Thanks, Dalu. And the last 1 minute, I'll give to you, Isabel, before handing over to the minister.
Thanks. I think there's a few things that is necessary. One, clear, simple pricing policies that are fully transparent so that everybody from your funders all the way to your consumers know exactly what they're in for and why. The why is often the area where everybody is confused as to what are these extra charges that I'm looking at. But more so than transparent pricing, we also need to look at some innovation as to how we tackle this. We are all in this together. We need to work together and find innovative solutions. One such solution would be aggregated trading. There's a number of traders in the industry, and there is space for bilaterals. There's also space for aggregated trading, because there is a de-risking mechanism that would actually make many of these projects more bankable, specifically when it comes to the off-taker. We have many cases where the requirement is that you have to show for bankability your end customer, which is not necessarily an easy thing to do because that can be scalable. However, a pool of sources versus a pool of customers de-risks the whole framework. So that is just one example of, and we have done a couple of those as Greenco, but overall, I think it's mechanisms that we can learn from one another, that we can apply to the whole industry. And then, of course, the private investment part that comes in to broaden the horizons of the actual infrastructure strengthening If we don't address all of these aspects and we don't do it collaboratively, we will be imposing more delays on ourselves. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to the panelists. And I think a very strong message of opportunity from Lisa, right? I think 2, collaboration from Jed, 3, commitment from Dalu, and I think innovation from you, Isabel. So I think very powerful messages, one that I'm sure resonates with everybody. Thank you for your words today. And I'm going to hand over to the Minister for closing remarks. In the interest of time, I'll ask you to stay on stage and ask you, Minister, to come up.
Thanks very much, Kesh. And let me thank everyone for the opportunity and for the panel and the discussion that we've had today. I think it's very clear that each of us need to be able to play our roles, and we need to do that well. Whether it's the private sector, whether it's government, each of us need to do what we are mandated to do. And I think from a government side of things, we certainly in South Africa have realized and understand the importance of collaborations, whether they are with different governments or with the private sector. I think the South Africa that you see today is a more collaborative version that it's ever been, and more particularly under this government of national unity that we are in. And perspective is always important when you look at issues like this, and that's why I'm glad that you could cast your mind back to when you first arrived. And I think that you would see that South Africa, in terms of how we have stepped up collaboration, is far different today than it was 15 years ago. You know, one of the projects that we are very keenly involved in is around transmission. And, you know, you solve one problem only to create another problem. Maybe that might be a lesson for Zambia, that as you step up your power production, how do you then get it around the country? And, you know, one of the things that we acted very quickly to do towards the end of last year was to provide the land parcels for those first tranches of transmission that will be put out. And I remember many officials in my department said, "Oh, Minister, you know, if anyone ever tells you that there's a process in government, you must know that that's a colloquial word for it being dragged out forever." And there was always this forever process going on. We just said, we've got to get it done, and we've got to actually start speeding up this, because the longer that we drag out the transmission rollout, the bigger the problem actually becomes. And the investable case for new power in South Africa actually starts to decrease. And so it's through those sorts of collaborations, whether they intergovernmental or with the private sector, that we are absolutely convinced will solve the problems that we continue to face. And it's really through people like yourselves in this room that also then have that responsibility to continue to engage government, even albeit when we don't want to listen at times. But, you know, use those forums that exist, use organizations, use platforms like this, Mining Indaba, or wherever you may find yourselves, to continue to do so. Because we think that South Africa remains one of the great investment destinations of this country. And I really take to heart the words that High Commissioner Phillipson said earlier, and they have been great friends, not only of my department, but also of South Africa. And we, as I said last night at the party that none of you were at, that, we open those doors of opportunity, not only to the private sector, but to many more countries as well. So let me thank you, Chantal, for the invitation to be here. I have known Chantal for a while now, and I think the work that you guys at Invest Africa are doing is fantastic for us here in South Africa and on the continent. And I certainly look forward to joining you on more of your roadshows as you continue for the rest of your year. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister Macpherson. Thank you, High Commissioner, as well. Thank you to all the panelists, to all these guests. I can just speak about the volume of people in this room. Talks for itself. The quality of this panel was amazing. So is also the partnership that we have on Growth Gateway with BCG. Thank you so much for your partnership on that. I have so much more to say, but I do know that Minister is on a very tight schedule. So I suppose that leaves me to say thank you so very much for your time, your effort, your focus to be here today. Thank you for joining the 13th mining series. And this brings it to a close, but with a caveat that I do look forward to seeing you tonight with many clashes that you may have at Utopia, where we will have some of the South African government and also Africa Finance Corporation. So thank you very much, everybody, and I will see you soon.